Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of our course. So, this week I'm hoping to globalize our discussion of revolutions from last week. The readings from the reading from the textbook is short, but there's a lot in it. And I've also got two incredibly important documents for you to peruse this week. So, as always, please reach out to me if there's anything that isn't making sense with regards to the readings, discussion board posts, or focus questions. So in this slide, you've got my face, and the building on the left is the Haitian National Palace, which, as it appeared before the 2010 earthquake. The structure in the middle is the entrance to the headquarters of the old Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria. And the statue on the right is one of Simon Bolivar that happens to be in Washington, D.C. Those similar statues dot the Western Hemisphere. The dude's even got a country named after him, Bolivia. So these buildings are and I actually Googled to see if there's a statue of Washington in La Paz, Bolivia, and I couldn't find that there is, which is fine. Okay, so these buildings are statues. They are all everything on this slide shows legacies of revolutions that came in the wake of the American and French revolutions, and they all were reactions to the emergence of the modern world. All of these revolutions have ramifications that absolutely still matter today as well. So let me move on. All right, so one of the primary documents that I alluded to last week was the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. This document, in and of itself, was part of an act of rebellion. It's one of the first things drafted by the new assembly in Paris in August of 1789. Like the American Declaration of Independence, it is a foundational document of classical liberalism. Its ideas are incorporated into constitutions all around the world. It also came out 1 month before our American Bill of Rights as well. Both documents have very similar ideas. One of my focus questions for this week asks you to think about the relevance of one of the articles in the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. So the other source is the Declaration on the Rights of Woman. This was never ratified by the Assembly and was written more as a joke, but a very serious joke, highlighting the hypocrisy of the revolution. Its author, the activist and actor Olympe de Gouges, would ultimately be put on trial by the Committee for Public Safety for being an unnatural woman in their assessment. She was especially bitter given the key role women had played in making the revolution happen in the first place. It was in salons, private meeting places, where women brought together people to get them talking about the ideas of liberalism to begin with. It was women who led so many of the bread riots, including the storming of the Bastille. So Degouget wondered why none of the rights they had fought for applied to them. In the end, she was executed. And as you look over her document, I want you to for your focus question to think seriously about why women's rights need to be guaranteed in order for there really to be any rights at all. So there would be decades, centuries of women after her continuing the fight, of course. So let me jump to this slide. You saw this slide last week, and I just want to repeat how important the Haitian Revolution was to inspiring activists against slavery and to inspiring revolutions all over the Western Hemisphere and by default the world. And it should be inspiring to humanity as a whole to see mostly illiterate slaves taking control of their own destinies and forming a republic. One person who gained direct inspiration from here, my face is just kind of in the way. I'll be with El Libertador right there. All right. From Haiti, who gained inspiration from Haiti as well as his contact with Napoleon and other French revolutionaries, was Simon Bolivar, a nobleman and a person who was once a slave owner from Caracas. So, after becoming converted to revolutionary ideology, he freed his slaves and became a military leader, fighting for independence from Spain across Central and South America. Uh, the guy is a rock star in the history of South and Central America. He's rightly had lots of movies made about his life, most of which are in my Netflix queue. Um, and one of the advantages he had was that Spain was rather weak at administering its colonies after Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1807. The majority of your reading for this week deals with Spanish colonies in the New World in the aftermath of Napoleon's attack on their home country. So, one of his goals, Bolivar's goals, we're gonna let's keep my face right there, um, was to unify the Spanish-speaking colonies into a republic inspired by the United States of America. His Gran Colombia lasted only 10 years and shows how fragile such experiments in creating federations can be. The fact that the United States was able to combine, survive a brutal war over slavery, and still stick together is really an aberration in world history rather than a norm. Many Spanish speakers would like to see closer political cooperation in the Americas, but elites have often resented any loss of their power to supranational authorities. It's the same kind of tension causing problems in the European Union today. So I hope the flag in this picture shocks you. The flags. It's a picture from 2012 of self-identifying Brazilian Confederates who are celebrating their heritage as descendants of Confederate landowners who fled to Brazil in 1865 after the Union victory in the American Civil War. The Brazilian Republic at the time welcomed them as their government didn't abolish slavery until later in 1888. Uh, by the way, Brazilians get as annoyed by this flag as Americans do, though it's also had its defenders in Brazil who say stuff like, it's not hatred, it's just a part of our heritage or part of our history. So that history in both Brazil and the United States involved violence in support of enslaving other human beings. So, how did Brazil get to be that way in the 1880s if they still had slavery? They, like so many Spanish colonies, Brazil was a Portuguese colony, also revolted after Napoleon's invasion. The difference is that they were hosting the royal family of Portugal at the time, who had fled there. So, imagine how the American Revolution might have gone down if King George III was a house guest of the Continental Congress when we declared our independence. So, the Brazilians basically said, we've got a country right now. You don't, so we'll still keep you as our king, but we're going to do things our own way now. So they became fully autonomous after 1822 and established a republic that was explicitly a republic for slaveholders, with far fewer compromises than the American Constitution had. So Brazil had become a force of conservatism. Earlier, it had been a force of conservatism fighting against Bolivar, and it continued to be a conservative force in favor of slavery as revolution swirled along its borders. And they were the last country in the Western Hemisphere to officially abolish slavery. Okay, trying to scroll on here. So I want to make sure to discuss Mexico as part of all of this too, as its independence both diverged from and dovetailed with movements in the rest of the Americas. So one of the big differences Mexico had compared to other revolutions we've discussed so far was the nature of its people. Mexico was and still is the most populous Spanish-speaking country in the Western Hemisphere. But unlike the English-speaking colonies to the north, where populations polarized between the enslaved and the patriarchies of free white smallholders, um, and of course the large slave owners, Mexico was largely made up of peasants. To be sure, there were slaves. Slavery had a history among Mesoamerican peoples, and African slavery had been practiced there for 100 years before the first African slaves came to Jamestown. But slavery didn't as easily take root in Mexico. For starters, Mexico was a big country with few Spaniards, so it was very easy to escape, especially in the jungles to the south where the most lucrative plantation crops could be grown. Um, 1 year before the first slaves were auctioned off at Jamestown, Spanish authorities in Mexico actually signed a treaty recognizing the rights of maroon slave settlements. By the time Mexico gained its independence, African slavery had largely died out. Mexicans outlawed the slave trade in 1817 and completely abolished slavery in 1829. Mexican opposition to slavery was the prime sticking point with Anglo settlers in Texas who wanted to bring their slaves along, leading to the Texas War for Independence from Mexico. But anyways, so back to the Napoleonic Wars. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, Mexico was a large series of interlocking feudal-style estates where people took pride in a mestizo identity, mixing European and native ancestry. People had an identity of class based unity in opposition to the largely European landowners and wealthy elites. So, as the Napoleonic Wars continued to bog down Spanish imperial authorities, on September 16th, 1810, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the church bell in Guanajuato and shouted the cry of Dolores, where he beckoned to Mexican nationalism and the rights of peasants to not be oppressed by foreign overlords. Over the next decade, Mexico won autonomy, then independence from Spain, which eventually realized it was too costly to try to retake Mexico. So, when describing France last week, I mentioned tension between religion and the revolution. In the United States, what developed in the Young Republic was the abolishment of state sponsored churches and total separation of church and state, which allowed religions to become stronger and more vibrant as they focused on the spiritual realm. What occurred in Mexico was that the church, or at least some priests close to the people, became active promoters of revolution, making Catholicism a key marker of identity as the state became independent. So let's switch to Africa now. I really like these two maps. So just to show how, and that's not 2020 anymore. It's 2021. Can I change that? Yeah, there we go. The map is the same. So I like visualizing these maps just to show how West Africa has changed over the past 500 years. So for much of West African history, its main political unit looked a lot like the one on the left. The Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires all existed along the Niger River and controlled trade going across the Sahara. And that trade was with the empires and peoples of the Middle East and Mediterranean region. West Africa's largest cities were often like port cities along a sea of sand. To the south, you had smaller political units, not nothing, as this map here implies, that traded with and fought with the empires to the north. By the time the Portuguese figured out how to sail against the West African winds and lack of winds or doldrums, the nexus of trade would shift from the Sahara to the Atlantic Ocean. So by the 1700s, the most powerful West African kingdoms were along the Atlantic Ocean, some of which became the cores of independent countries that you can still see today. So today, the bulk of West Africa's population is close to the ocean, while the arid regions of the northern belt of West Africa, once the trade centers of antiquity, are far more lightly populated. Mali, for instance, has 19 million people. I mean, the once bustling city of Timbuktu has about 50,000 people today. Um, Niger has 20 million, compared to 20 million. So I mean, just look at this. Mali and Niger both have about 20 million people, whereas the teeny little countries here of Togo and Benin also have 20 million people, compared to Nigeria, which has an enormous population of 200 million people. So the people in West Africa, far more of them live here than up here. Okay, so before getting, let me switch to the Fulani. I'm covering important stuff here. All right. Great billboard from Nigeria. All right, so before getting to the Fulani Jihad and the role of Usman Dan Fodio, I want to briefly cover, 1,000 years of Islamic history in West Africa. So it's easy to do because despite a rich tradition of believers, for 1,000 years, Islam had a difficult time taking root among ordinary West Africans, in large part, in my opinion, because of slavery. So for a long time, Islam had a troubling relationship with slavery, much like Christianity did in the same period and later. Both religions, Christianity and Islam, are based on peace, love, devotion to God, and service towards others. Both, at their core, religiously, are completely incompatible with slavery. But both emerged in a world where slavery was normal, and in places like the Pauline epistles of the New Testament and certain passages in the Quran, the very fact that slaves are mentioned was used as justification by unscrupulous believers, even though they go completely contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ or the revelations to the prophet. Um, so the fact that both Christians and Muslims came up with totally nonsense justifications for slavery made it difficult for ordinary people to accept these religions in areas where people sought slaves to capture. So the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires, those were all Islamic empires, but few people around them accepted a religion of supposed peace that hypocritically allowed for and carried out slave trading. That was until the emergence of Danfodio's Fulani Jihad that opposed the powers of empires that were complicit in slave trading and began to advocate a more pure devotion to Islam. So, over the course of the 19th century, people converted to Islam in droves, and it became a dominant religion in the northern tier of West Africa, just beyond the control of what were then the European imperialist powers. Um, and it was in large part because people practiced sincere devotion to Islam. It really is a nice religion when practiced properly. Same with Christianity, and there are many variants. So, Christianity uh, would also take root in the southern tier for the most part, largely after the end of colonialism. The Christianity of West Africa today has a freshness and a level of devotion that often exceeds that in the rest of the world, in large part because its sincerity derived from its relative newness, even though Christianity has been in West Africa for centuries, millennia. So on this slide, I've got two pictures that show contemporary Islam. Uh, or sorry, one picture. But so I wanted to point out that the extremist group, Boko Haram, it claims to follow the legacy of the Fulani Jihad. Most Africans reject them, and since 2015, Nigerian efforts to defeat Boko Haram, I'm sure you've heard about them in the news. This is a billboard in Nigeria celebrating their efforts, have helped to unify the country. Nigeria is a country that's split roughly 50-50 between Christians and Muslims. So hopefully they could be an example to people in other parts of the world dealing with religious tension between the world's two largest religious groups. And on the right here, this is a massive mosque that has been built in Lagos. Okay, so I mentioned Danfodio in the previous slide. Let me switch to this one now. Usman Dan Fodio was an Islamic scholar from the Kanem region of what is today Nigeria. It used to be part of the old Kanem Bornu kingdom. He preached against the poor adherence to Islam among people in his region, especially un Islamic activities like adultery, drinking alcohol, and gambling. In 1804, the same year as Haiti gained its independence, he inspired a military and spiritual jihad that succeeded in cementing political and spiritual control over a vast swath of northern West Africa. And I point to this history as another example of revolutionary activities in response to the emergence of the modern world. Ousmane Danfodio was literate in many languages, was very, very aware of the French Revolution. I'll put my face in the ocean here. I didn't realize I'd fallen off the slideshow. Okay, so for my final slide, I want to jump back to Europe and look at the idea of romantic nationalism. Oh, get my face out of the way. I'll be right up there next to Herder. How you going, Herder? Okay, so last week we talked about nationalism as one of the modern ideas that emerged in the wake of the French Revolution. One of the areas of Europe where it was strongest was among Slavs and German speakers. German speakers, in particular, were divided among numerous principalities in what had been the Holy Roman Empire, as well as outside states like Habsburg Austria, Switzerland. And Germans were scattered in small settlements across Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe, all the way to the Volga River in Russia. So, one of the ideas that emerged among these people who spoke various dialects of German, some very difficult to understand, uh, was that they could be more free, could realize their aspirations as people more fully if they could join themselves to a nation of like minded people with a similar language, ethnic origin, culture, food, stories, etc. So Herder is one of the big thinkers here who hoped that world peace would come from people becoming unified into their own national units, nation states. The problem in Europe and most of the world, of course, is that when you try to have pure ethno national spaces, you end up having people who nationalists imagine as not belonging. So the aspiration to have a pure national space, to have a Germany of just Germans, for example, or a Poland of just Poles, would lead to some of the worst crimes against humanity in history. And unfortunately, they're ongoing, in places like Myanmar today. So on this slide, I've also got the Brothers Grimm, who you've probably heard of before. They copied a lot of the fairy tales you maybe learned as a child. They believe that recording the folklores and stories of ethnic Germans would help create a canon of literature upon which they could base a better understanding of German identity, German values. So that is a whirlwind global tour Oh, let me global to ooh, get my face out of the way. I'll put my face over here. Of some highlights of revolutions and revolutionary thinking in the wake of Napoleon. So for the bonus questions this week, I left them a bit open-ended, but hopefully as easy and quick. They'll be as easy and quick as they've been for previous weeks. But just to tie it all together, we are looking at a period when revolutions begin to spread all over the world. Some are directly inspired by Napoleon and the ideals of the French Revolution, like Haiti and those in Latin and Central and South America. Some are inspired by religious movements that are reactions to the modern world, especially the massive jihad in West Africa that established the Sokoto Caliphate. We'll, discuss more of the ideas of constitutionalism and liberalism as they spread through the Middle East to the Far East. In Europe itself, you know, those areas that had tasted the republicanism and the rights of Napoleon, they wanted more. And so nationalism, in the minds of many people, became tied up with the ideas of having, the rights of a constitution, the rights of the rule of law, and the rights of a republic where people could represent themselves. So, lots to tie together. Fun reading, and let's continue on. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good week.